Hi everyone, it's Delaney here, and this is my presentation of my book review, so I hope you enjoy. For those of you who may not know, I am an adolescent English education major focusing in TESOL, which is why I found this book to call to me in particular. The book I chose to review is called Growing Language and Literacy, Strategies for English Learners, and it was written by Andrea Honigsfeld for grades K through 8. Here's the book. I'm going to read you a little blurb about Andrea, which is found on the back of her book. Andrea Honigsfeld is Associate Dean and Director of the Doctoral Program, Educational Leadership for Diverse Learning Communities at Molloy College. A former ESL teacher, Andrea is the co-author or co-editor of over 20 books on education, including the core Instructional Routine series. I didn't know this when I bought this book. I had no idea that Andrea Honigsfeld worked at Molloy or had anything to do with it, so this was a funny coincidence, and I hope I get to meet with her one day to talk about the book. There are three main things that I would like to talk to you about in reference to this book. The first one is pedagogy. I want to show you how Honigsfeld's pedagogy comes through the book and how you can see her own personal passion to be a teacher come through this book and what she believes in and how it can be applied through the classroom. The next thing I would like to talk about will be the structure of the book itself and how helpful I found the chapter structure of this to work for a teacher. And then next we'll get into a little bit of the content of the book itself. As I mentioned, the first thing I would like to talk about is Honigsfeld's pedagogy. I believe that Honigsfeld is a very dedicated person. She's very dedicated to the art and craft of teaching, and I think this can first be reflected through her dedication. This might be something simple that people overlook when reading this book, but I think it really sets the tone for the rest of the book. And the dedication reads like this. I dedicate this book to all the children who have come to this country with their hopes and aspirations, and their brave families who left everything behind to find a better life. I also dedicate this book to my children, Ben, Jacob, and Noah. I have loved the wonderful years of watching them grow their languages and literacies. I think there's something to be said about the personal passion that a teacher brings to their classroom. I think you can tell through her dedication that Honigsfeld, clearly cares about her students the same way that she cares about her own children. She is passionate about their growing languages and literacies. She's so proud of these students who come to her classrooms who've braved thousands of miles of journeys to make it to the United States to be a part of a classroom where they can thrive and succeed. And I think that says a lot about her pedagogy, and I hope that you can see that. So in the beginning of the book, we're introduced to Honigsfeld's 5 basic premises. And I think this also has a lot to say about Honigsfeld's personal pedagogy, as these 5 basic premises are the cornerstone of this book. The 5 basic premises that she goes through are an assets-based philosophy, individual variation, integrated content, language, and literacy instruction, culturally and linguistically sustaining instructional and assessment practices, and number 5, purposeful interaction and collaboration. To me, the most poignant of these 5 basic premises was the first one, assets-based philosophy, because I found that it had a lot of deep connection between Honigsfeld's personal pedagogy and how it can be applied for any teacher to the classroom. And I'll read you the definition as it goes like this. According to a deficit model, students are at an academic disadvantage due to their cultural, social, and linguistic backgrounds, including their lack of or limited ability to communicate in English. In contrast, an assets-based model of education considers and intentionally builds upon the values, lived experiences, language patterns, and background knowledge students bring and sees them as strengths and advantages that support, not hinder learning. I believe that this assets-based philosophy can be most found throughout the book, along with the individual variation, which reads, ELs, English learners, are unique individuals who move along the continuum of language learning at different rates. I think this is very profound throughout this book. I think it says a lot about the patience a teacher must have. It says a lot about, how we as teachers must view every individual student as an asset, and the things that they bring to the classroom are not a struggle that we have to overcome to get them to learn the content. However, the personal skills, the personal background that they have, the challenge that they've gone through are the thing that are going to help them learn, not the thing that we have to overcome in order to get them to learn. Now let's move on to the structure of the book. There are 5 chapters in this book, and they coincide with the 5 levels of language proficiency. So Chapter 1 follows starting level language proficiency students, Chapter 2 focuses on emerging students, Chapter 3 developing, 4 expanding, and 5 is bridging. These 5 levels of language proficiency are based on the TESOL framework, and they are ways to categorize your students based on exactly that, their language proficiency. So for example, the definition of a starting level English language learning student is being exposed to English with limited language production. The 4th level, expanding, would be defined as employing more advanced oral and written language skills with few errors. And 5, bridging, is approximating native language proficiency. But the wonderful thing about this book and Honigsfeld Pedagogy is that she recognizes that language acquisition is fluid and dynamic. So at any given moment, some students may exhibit some abilities at a higher proficiency level and others at a lower one. And again, the wonderful thing about this textbook is that the way it's written out, as a teacher, it's very easy to follow what level your student might be categorized as, but if they're showing examples of a higher or lower proficiency, it's very easy to access the knowledge you need in this textbook. And the chapter structure of the book reflects this as well. So each chapter is laid out the same. It follows the same subheadings. So for example, every level begins with who are X students. So for example, if I'm reading here, who are developing level students, in the same way that who are emerging level students. They both start at the same level. And we move on, each chapter heading, each subtitle under each chapter is the same. So if you had a student who was a developing level English student and you said, what practices support developing level students? Well, I feel as if my student perhaps is a little bit beyond this. Let me go to the expanding level chapter and see what practices I can implement for my developing level student, even though they're showing expanding level proficiencies. And again, I believe that this chapter structure reflects Honigsfeld's pedagogy because it shows that individual students are going to be demonstrating different proficiency levels, and here's a textbook that allows you to move through the book in an organized fashion and still keep up with your students' needs. Every chapter begins with who are X level students. For example, here as I've shown, we have who are starting level students. So every chapter begins with an introduction of 2 students who qualify under that category. I'm going to read you some bits here of Tamir's understanding so you can understand why it's so important to know a little bit about your student and their background before they enter your classroom. Tamir is a 12-year-old boy from Syria whose family has suffered greatly since the start of the civil war in 2011. He lost his home and several close family members in Aleppo, Syria, when his neighborhood was bombed. Tamir's father, who was an instructor at the Mammon University for Science and Technology, tried to help him continue his education, but the lack of appropriate textbooks and school supplies limited the scope of their students. By pointing to a map, Tamir was able to share that the family migrated through Turkey, Eastern Europe, and Germany on their long journey to the United States. Tamir understands basic commands and directions, especially when his teacher uses gestures and visual cues. 2 months after his arrival, he had not yet spoken English to any of his peers or teachers, but he pays more attention in class now and does not always sit alone in the cafeteria. These little bits of information are very important if you had Tamir as a student. It would be very important to know that he had gone through such trauma. The book asks you to stop and reflect, and it asks, why is it important to understand the complex experiences that Tamir brings to school? In what ways should Tamir's teacher respond to the trauma that he has lived through? What assets can his teacher tap into? What would you do to help Tamir? It's very important as teachers to understand what your student has gone through before they come to you, so that you can understand how you would react to his behavior, how you could get him to engage more with the language, and what personal and academic support he might need in your own classroom. And again, I think this just goes to show how Honigsfeld's pedagogy comes through this book, because she wants us as teachers to be aware of the individual world that is going on in each of our students' heads. So now let's talk a little bit about the content of this book. The third basic premise of the book, which again is a part of the cornerstone of this book, is integrated content, language, and literacy instruction. What Honigsfeld means by an integrated content, language, and literacy instruction is that language is a system of communication. We use it every day. We use it across the subjects, And so for students who are learning English especially, but also for native English speakers, it is important to integrate learning language across every subject because it's necessary for every subject. So an example here in the textbook that I found was a great showcase of this premise was a math vocabulary anchor chart. And you can see that it shows slight synonyms or short definitions of a math vocabulary word and what it might mean in more colloquial plain English for somebody who doesn't know English math vocabulary. I also thought this anchor chart was very clever because the teacher chose to use an equal sign, which is a symbol in math vocabulary in the system of language of communication in math, to say this means equals. I think this is a great culmination of how English language vocabulary transfers across the subjects. And so just because it's time to study math doesn't mean literacy instruction stops. If you can't understand the full context of a sentence, the student might not be able to complete the math lesson. And so it's important to integrate language learning across all fields of subject. Unfortunately, I did feel that this fourth basic premise was lacking a little bit from the book. The fourth basic premise is culturally and linguistically sustaining instructional and assessment practices. I was expecting to see ways that a student's personal background could be integrated into the curriculum. But I believe that this is hard to apply in the classroom and it's hard to apply in the book because of something called funds of knowledge. Honigsfeld recognizes a funds of knowledge to be something that all students come to school with. And they come to school with a tremendous amount of knowledge derived from home and community-based shared experiences that are often unrelated to the taught curriculum and skills needed for academic success. For students who come to the United States having experienced another culture in another community, their funds of knowledge are different than ours, and they're different than the typical American English-speaking student. So I think that it's hard to sustain a student's linguistic and cultural background in an American learning environment because our funds of knowledge are different, and it would be impossible for us to include every single aspect of their culture into the classroom. What I do think about this premise is important is to make sure that students feel welcome, that they feel safe, and that they're encouraged to learn and to add to their knowledge, not just their funds of knowledge. It's also important not to discredit a student's funds of knowledge. Just because it's not something that we're learning in the classroom doesn't mean that it's not valuable. Doesn't mean that it doesn't make up part of their identity. So it's important not to discredit this, but I can understand how it maybe would be hard to apply this to the classroom. I really enjoyed reading this book, and I hope I taught you all a little bit about the Growing Language and Literacy book by Andrea Honigsfeld. And I can definitely see myself using a lot of these practices in my own classroom someday. I especially loved the assets-based philosophy that Honigsfeld talks about, and I think that that is such a valid form of teaching that we should all take to our classrooms, not just ones where we have English language learners, but for every student, because it's important to know that what every student brings to the classroom is different, it's important, and it's our job as teachers to recognize that. So thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure to learn with you this past semester. I hope you enjoy your break over the next holiday season. Thank you so much.